Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez had always prided himself on reading people. After 12 years in the military, he thought he could spot trouble from a mile away. That confidence would prove to be his biggest mistake. The morning started like any other at the Joint Military Training Facility in Virginia. Marcus was leading a group of new recruits through basic combat training when he noticed her. She stood apart from the others, a woman who looked completely out of place among the seasoned soldiers. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore civilian clothes instead of military gear. She appeared to be in her late 20s with a slender build that suggested she spent more time behind a desk than in a gym. "Who's the civilian?" Marcus asked Sergeant Williams, nodding toward the woman who was observing their training session from the sidelines. "New transfer, sir. Supposed to join today's combat assessment," Williams replied, checking his clipboard. "Name's Sarah Chen. Came in this morning with special orders from command." Marcus frowned. Special orders usually meant politics, and he hated politics interfering with his training program. He walked over to where Sarah stood, her arms crossed as she watched the recruits struggling through obstacle courses. "Ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Rodriguez. I understand you're here for combat assessment." His tone was polite but carried an undertone of skepticism. Sarah turned to face him, her green eyes meeting his with surprising directness. "That's right, Lieutenant. I'm ready when you are." There was something about her calm demeanor that irritated Marcus. She spoke with quiet confidence, but he saw no evidence of the physical conditioning that real combat required. Her hands were soft, lacking the calluses that came from years of weapons training. Her posture was relaxed, almost casual, nothing like the alert stance of a trained soldier. "With respect, ma'am, combat assessment isn't a game. These exercises are designed to push experienced soldiers to their limits. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer to observe today and start training tomorrow?" A slight smile played at the corners of Sarah's mouth. "I appreciate your concern, Lieutenant, but I think I can handle it." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. In his experience, overconfidence was dangerous, especially when it came from someone who clearly didn't understand what they were getting into. He'd seen too many people get hurt because they thought military training was something they could fake their way through. "Very well, but we do things by the book here. No special treatment." He gestured toward the obstacle course where other soldiers were finishing their runs. "Standard combat assessment includes physical conditioning, weapons handling, and hand-to-hand combat scenarios." "Sounds perfect," Sarah replied, still maintaining that maddeningly calm expression. Marcus assigned her to the group currently rotating through exercises. He watched as she completed the obstacle course with decent but unremarkable time. Her weapons handling was competent, nothing special. She followed instructions well and didn't complain, but Marcus saw nothing that indicated any real combat experience. It was during the hand-to-hand combat portion that things took an unexpected turn. The exercise was supposed to be a simple demonstration of basic defensive techniques. Each participant would face off against Marcus himself, who would attack with controlled movements, allowing them to practice blocks and counter moves. When Sarah's turn came, Marcus approached the mat with the same routine he'd used dozens of times that day. He would throw a slow, telegraphed punch. She would attempt to block or dodge, and he would provide feedback on her technique. "Simple, safe, educational. Ready?" he asked, raising his fists in a basic fighting stance. Sarah nodded, settling into what looked like a textbook defensive position. Nothing about her stance suggested any real training, though Marcus noted she kept her balance well. He threw the punch, a slow right cross aimed at her shoulder, the same move he'd used with every other participant. What happened next defied everything he thought he knew about combat training. Sarah's response was lightning fast. Instead of the clumsy block he expected, she stepped inside his punch with fluid precision. Her left hand deflected his arm while her right drove forward in a perfectly executed strike to his solar plexus. The blow landed with surprising force, driving the air from his lungs and sending him stumbling backward. Before Marcus could recover, Sarah had pivoted on her left foot and swept his legs. He found himself flat on his back, staring up at the ceiling while Sarah stood over him, not even breathing hard. The entire training ground had gone silent. 20 soldiers and 3 instructors stood frozen, mouths open as they processed what they'd just witnessed. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, a man who had trained thousands of soldiers and had never been taken down during a demonstration, was lying on his back courtesy of the civilian woman they'd all dismissed. Marcus struggled to his feet, his face burning with embarrassment and confusion. His ribs ached where Sarah's strike had landed, and he could feel the eyes of every person in the facility boring into him. In 12 years of military service, he had never been so completely and efficiently dismantled. "How did you—" he began, but Sarah held up a hand. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant. I should have warned you I had some training." Her voice carried a note of genuine apology, but her eyes sparkled with something that might have been amusement. "Some training?" Marcus repeated, still trying to process what had happened. The techniques she'd used weren't basic self-defense moves taught in weekend classes. They were advanced military-grade combat skills executed with the kind of precision that came from years of intensive practice. Sergeant Williams approached the mat, his expression a mixture of amazement and confusion. "Sir, should we continue the assessment?" Marcus looked at Sarah, who stood relaxed and ready, showing no signs of exertion despite having just dropped a trained military officer in front of his entire unit. There was clearly much more to this woman than anyone had told him. "I think," Marcus said slowly, his pride stinging but his curiosity piqued, "we need to have a conversation about exactly what kind of training you've had." "Ms. Chen," Sarah's smile widened slightly, "I think that might be a good idea, Lieutenant, though you might want to sit down for it." As Marcus led her away from the stunned group of soldiers, he couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully ordered world was about to be turned completely upside down. The woman who had looked so out of place just minutes ago now seemed like the most dangerous person on the entire base. He had no idea just how right he was. Marcus led Sarah to his office, his mind racing with questions. The short walk felt longer than usual, as word of what had happened spread through the facility like wildfire. He could hear whispered conversations and see soldiers craning their necks to get another look at the woman who had just humiliated their combat instructor. Once inside his office, Marcus closed the door and gestured for Sarah to take a seat. She settled into the chair across from his desk with the same calm composure she'd maintained throughout the entire encounter. Marcus remained standing, partly because sitting felt too casual after what had just happened, and partly because his ribs still ached from her strike. "All right, Ms. Chen," he began, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "I think it's time you told me exactly who you are and what you're doing here." Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying him with those sharp green eyes. "You can call me Sarah, and I'm here because your commanding officer requested someone to evaluate your training program." "Evaluate?" Marcus felt his blood pressure rising. "You're here to evaluate me?" "Not you personally," Sarah clarified. "The program. Command wants to know if the current training methods are adequately preparing soldiers for real-world combat situations." Marcus crossed his arms, wincing slightly as the movement aggravated his sore ribs. "And they sent a civilian to make that assessment?" "Did they tell you I was a civilian?" Sarah asked, tilting her head slightly. The question caught Marcus off guard. He thought back to his conversation with Sergeant Williams. "You're not in uniform. You don't carry yourself like military personnel. And your paperwork?" He trailed off, realizing he hadn't actually seen any paperwork. "My paperwork probably says very little," Sarah said with a slight smile. "That's by design." "What's by design? Who are you, really?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "Tell me something, Lieutenant. In your 12 years of service, how many times have you been taken down during a training demonstration?" "Never," Marcus admitted reluctantly. "And how many of your students have ever successfully executed the combination I just used?" Marcus thought about it. "None. Those weren't basic techniques. The timing, the precision. That takes years to develop." "It takes 8 years minimum," Sarah said. 8 years of intensive training, followed by practical application in the field. The pieces were starting to come together in Marcus's mind, but he hardly dared believe what he was thinking. "What branch?" "Officially? I work for the Department of Defense in a consulting capacity." Sarah's voice was carefully neutral. "Unofficially? Let's just say I've had extensive experience in specialized military operations." Marcus felt his mouth go dry. "Special operations?" Sarah didn't answer directly, but her silence was answer enough. Marcus had trained with Special Forces personnel before. They carried themselves differently, moved differently, thought differently than regular military. The techniques Sarah had used, the effortless way she'd taken him down, it all made sense now. How specialized. He pressed. "The kind where they don't put your name on anything permanent," Sarah replied. "The kind where your family thinks you work behind a desk somewhere safe." Marcus sat down heavily in his chair, his mind reeling. No wonder she had seemed so out of place. She was supposed to seem out of place. Navy SEALs? Sarah's slight nod confirmed his suspicion. Among other things. Among other things, Marcus repeated. Jesus, how long? 12 years active duty. 4 years consulting. Sarah leaned forward slightly. And before you ask, yes, that means I've been in active combat. Multiple deployments, multiple theaters. I've done things and seen things that most people can't imagine. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, trying to process this information. So when you showed up here this morning looking like a soccer mom who got lost on her way to the PTA meeting? Sarah finished with a grin. That was intentional. We wanted to see how your training program handles unexpected variables. In real combat, your enemies don't always look like what you expect. We? Command. Higher up than your commanding officer. There have been concerns about whether current training adequately prepares soldiers for asymmetric warfare, for situations where the enemy doesn't fit the traditional profile. Marcus thought about the morning's events from this new perspective. So this was all a test? Partly. The combat assessment is real. Command does want me to evaluate your program, but the way I presented myself, the assumptions everyone made about me, that was all part of gathering data. Data on what? Sarah stood and walked to the window overlooking the training ground. How quickly trained military personnel can adapt when their assumptions are challenged. How they react when faced with an opponent who doesn't fit their mental model of a threat. Marcus joined her at the window. Outside, he could see soldiers still talking animatedly about what they'd witnessed. And what's your assessment so far? Honestly? Not great, Sarah said bluntly. It took you less than 5 minutes to categorize me as a non-threat based purely on appearance. You made tactical decisions based on assumptions rather than evidence, and when those assumptions proved wrong, you were completely unprepared. The words stung because Marcus knew they were true. In my defense, you were deliberately misleading. Of course I was. Do you think enemy combatants wear signs announcing their capabilities? Sarah turned to face him. In Afghanistan, some of the deadliest fighters I encountered were teenagers who looked like they should be in school. In Syria, I saw grandmothers who could build explosives that would take out an entire convoy. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. You're saying our training is inadequate. I'm saying your training is focused on fighting an army that doesn't exist anymore, Sarah replied. Modern warfare isn't about two uniformed forces meeting on a battlefield. It's about identifying threats that hide in plain sight, adapting to situations that change in seconds, thinking 3 steps ahead of opponents who don't follow conventional rules. So what do you recommend? Sarah smiled, and for the first time, Marcus saw something predatory in her expression. That depends. How attached are you to your current training methods? Not very if they don't work. Good. Because if you really want to prepare your soldiers for what they'll face out there, we're going to have to tear down everything you think you know about combat training and build it back up from scratch. Marcus looked out at his soldiers, thinking about the men and women he was responsible for preparing for combat. What would that look like? Scenario-based training with real variables. Opponents who don't look like opponents. Situations where the rules change without warning. Training that teaches soldiers to question their assumptions and adapt in real time. That sounds... Marcus paused, searching for the right word. Terrifying? Sarah suggested. It should be. Combat is terrifying. If your soldiers aren't prepared for that, they're not prepared for anything. Marcus turned back to Sarah, seeing her clearly for the first time since she'd arrived. This wasn't just a woman who had embarrassed him in front of his unit. This was a warrior who had survived things he could barely imagine, offering to share knowledge that could save lives. When do we start? He asked. Sarah's smile widened. We already have. Class is in session, Lieutenant. Question is, are you ready to be a student? The next morning, Marcus arrived at the training facility an hour early, his mind still processing everything Sarah had told him. He'd spent most of the night researching asymmetric warfare tactics and reading after-action reports from recent conflicts. The more he learned, the more he realized how unprepared his training program really was. Sarah was already there when he arrived, but she looked completely different. Gone were the civilian clothes and casual demeanor. She wore military fatigues with no visible rank insignia. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her entire bearing screamed professional soldier. The transformation was so complete that Marcus had to look twice to confirm it was the same person. Good morning. Lieutenant, she said, her voice carrying a crisp military tone that hadn't been there the day before. Ready for day 2? I have to ask, Marcus said. Yesterday you looked like someone you could dismiss without a second thought, Sarah finished. Today I look like someone you'd take seriously in a combat situation. That's the point. Your enemies won't give you the courtesy of looking the part. Marcus nodded, beginning to understand. So what's the lesson plan? First, we need to see how your current students handle unexpected scenarios. Sarah gestured toward the training ground where soldiers were beginning to arrive. I've prepared a series of exercises that will test their ability to adapt when their expectations are challenged. As the morning progressed, Marcus watched in fascination as Sarah put his soldiers through scenarios unlike anything in the standard training manual. In one exercise, she had them navigate an obstacle course, while civilian actors playing refugees moved through the same space, forcing the soldiers to complete their mission while protecting non-combatants. In another, she introduced false flag situations where supposed allies turned hostile without warning. The results were eye-opening and humbling. Soldiers who excelled at traditional combat exercises struggled when faced with ambiguous situations. Many froze when forced to make split-second decisions about who was a threat and who wasn't. Others became overly aggressive, treating every unknown variable as an enemy. Watch Corporal Jackson, Sarah murmured to Marcus as they observed one particularly challenging scenario. He's technically proficient, but he's operating on autopilot. He's not actually assessing the situation, just following predetermined patterns. Marcus saw what she meant. Jackson moved through the exercise with textbook precision, but when Sarah introduced an unexpected element, an elderly man who appeared to be lost, Jackson treated him as a potential threat rather than gathering information to make an informed decision. In real combat, that kind of thinking gets people killed, Sarah continued. Both your people and innocent civilians. The most revealing exercise came after lunch. Sarah had Marcus's soldiers enter a mock urban environment where they were supposed to locate and neutralize a high-value target. What they didn't know was that the target was actually a local teacher who had been hired to play a civilian, while the real threat was a quiet woman posing as a vendor in the marketplace. Marcus watched in growing dismay as his best soldiers walked right past the actual threat multiple times, focused entirely on finding someone who matched their preconceived notions of what a dangerous person looked like. It wasn't until the vendor simulated an attack that they realized their mistake. How many times has this exact scenario played out in real conflicts? Marcus asked Sarah as they debriefed. More than you want to know, she replied grimly. I've seen entire operations fail because intelligence was based on assumptions rather than evidence. I've watched good soldiers die because they couldn't adapt when the situation didn't match their training. That evening, Marcus found himself in Sarah's temporary office, going through after-action reports from various special operations missions. The documents had been heavily redacted, but even the sanitized versions told a story of warfare that bore little resemblance to what he'd been teaching. This operation in Yemen, Marcus said, pointing to one report. Your team was hunting a bomb maker, but the actual target turned out to be a 16-year-old girl whose older brother was the real bomb maker, Sarah finished. She was serving as a lookout and courier, looked completely innocent, acted completely innocent right up until she tried to detonate a suicide vest in the middle of a crowded market. Marcus set down the report, feeling sick. How do you train for something like that? You train soldiers to observe everything, assume nothing, and adapt constantly, Sarah replied. You teach them that survival depends on reading situations, not following scripts. But there has to be some structure, some basic principles they can rely on. Sarah leaned back in her chair. There are, but they're different from what you've been teaching. For example, traditional training teaches soldiers to identify and eliminate threats. Special operations training teaches you to identify and manage uncertainties. What's the difference? A threat is something you can see and engage. An uncertainty is something that might become a threat, might be neutral, or might actually be an asset. Most real-world situations are full of uncertainties, not clear threats. Marcus thought about this. So instead of teaching soldiers to react to threats, we need to teach them to navigate uncertainties. Exactly. And that requires a completely different mindset. It means being comfortable with not knowing, being ready to change course instantly, and making decisions with incomplete information. Sarah pulled out a tablet and showed Marcus a series of training scenarios she'd developed. These exercises are designed to build those skills. They put soldiers in situations where the right answer isn't obvious, where they have to gather information, assess risks, and make judgment calls. As Marcus scrolled through the scenarios, he realized they were unlike anything he'd ever seen in military training. They were complex, ambiguous, and required soldiers to think rather than simply react. "This one," he said, pointing to a scenario involving a hostage situation with multiple potential victims and unclear motivations. "How do you even score something like this?" "You don't score it in the traditional sense," Sarah explained. "You evaluate the decision-making process. Did the soldier gather available information? Did they consider multiple possibilities? Did they adapt when new information became available? Did they prioritize appropriately? That's much more subjective than our current evaluations. Real combat is subjective, Lieutenant. The enemy doesn't follow your training manual. Success depends on making good decisions under pressure, not on executing perfect techniques." Marcus closed the tablet and looked at Sarah. "How long would it take to implement this kind of training? For a complete overhaul? 6 months minimum, and that's assuming you have full support from command and access to the right resources." "What kind of resources?" "Actors who can play convincing civilians. Urban environments that can be reconfigured for different scenarios. Technology that can simulate real-world communications and intelligence. And most importantly, instructors who understand asymmetric warfare." Marcus felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. "Would you be willing to help implement it?" Sarah smiled. "Lieutenant, I didn't come here just to point out problems. I came here to fix them. The question is whether you're ready for the kind of changes this will require." "What do you mean?" "I mean everything you think you know about training soldiers is about to change. Your role will shift from instructor to facilitator. Your soldiers will go from following orders to making decisions, and you'll have to accept that sometimes they'll make mistakes. Because that's how they learn." Marcus thought about his soldiers, about the men and women whose lives might depend on the training he provided. "If it makes them more effective in combat, I'm willing to change everything." "Good," Sarah said, standing up. "Because tomorrow we start tearing down your current program and building something completely new. Fair warning, Lieutenant. It's going to be uncomfortable for everyone involved, including you." Sarah's expression grew serious. "Especially me. Teaching these skills means reliving experiences I'd rather forget. But if it saves lives, it's worth it." As Marcus left Sarah's office that night, he realized he was embarking on more than just a training overhaul. He was about to discover what real warfare looked like, and it was nothing like what he'd imagined. 3 weeks into the new training program, Marcus barely recognized his own facility. What had once been orderly rows of soldiers practicing identical movements now looked like controlled chaos. In one corner, a team worked through a hostage negotiation scenario, with actors playing frightened civilians. In another, soldiers practiced gathering intelligence from reluctant informants who might or might not be telling the truth. The transformation hadn't been easy. Several experienced instructors had struggled to adapt to Sarah's methods, and more than a few soldiers had complained about the increased complexity, but the results were undeniable. Marcus watched as Corporal Jackson, the same soldier who had struggled with adapting to unexpected variables just weeks before, successfully navigated a scenario where he had to determine which of 3 captured individuals was actually an enemy combatant. "He's learning to ask the right questions instead of making assumptions," Sarah observed, standing beside Marcus as they watched Jackson work. "Look at his body language. He's alert but not aggressive. He's gathering information instead of just reacting." Marcus nodded, impressed despite himself. "The improvement is remarkable. But I have to ask, how much of this comes from your personal experience?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, her eyes fixed on the training exercise. "All of it. Every scenario, every technique, every lesson learned in blood somewhere in the world. Can you tell me about it?" "Some of it." Sarah glanced around the training facility, then gestured toward her office. "Walk with me." Once they were alone, Sarah sat heavily in her chair, suddenly looking older than her years. "What do you want to know? How did you end up in special operations?" "It's not exactly a common career path," Sarah smiled ruefully. "Definitely not what I planned. I grew up in suburban California, graduated from UCLA with a degree in international relations. I was going to be a diplomat, solve conflicts with words instead of weapons, What changed? September 11th changed everything for a lot of people. For me, it changed the trajectory of my entire life. I enlisted the day after the towers fell, convinced that I could make a difference. Marcus leaned forward. And the SEALs? That came later. I was in Navy intelligence initially, analyzing communications intercepts and building target profiles. I was good at it, maybe too good. I had a knack for seeing patterns that others missed, for understanding how our enemies thought. That must have gotten someone's attention. It did. After about 2 years, I was approached by a recruiter for Naval Special Warfare. They needed someone who could think like the enemy but fight like a SEAL. The training was... Sarah paused, searching for the right words. Let's just say it made everything I'd experienced up to that point seem like summer camp. Marcus had heard stories about SEAL training, the legendary difficulty that broke more candidates than it produced. How many started with you? 37. 4 of us graduated. Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, but Marcus could hear the weight of memory behind it. I was the only woman in the program at that time. There were people who thought I didn't belong there. Did that motivate you? It motivated me to prove them wrong. But more than that, it motivated me to prove to myself that I could do whatever was necessary to protect people. Sarah stood and walked to a wall map marked with various global hotspots. My first deployment was to Afghanistan in 2003. I thought I was ready. I thought my training had prepared me for anything. But it hadn't. Sarah touched a spot on the map. No training can really prepare you for the reality of combat. The noise, the confusion, the speed at which everything happens, and most importantly, the fact that your enemies are just as smart, just as trained, and just as motivated as you are. What was your first mission like? Reconnaissance in the Hindu Kush Mountains. We were supposed to gather intelligence on Taliban movements in the region. Simple observation mission, minimal contact expected. Sarah's voice grew distant. We'd been in position for 3 days when we encountered a group of what appeared to be local farmers. They seemed harmless, just people trying to make a living in a war zone. Marcus sensed there was more to the story, but they weren't farmers. No, they weren't. They were spotters, feeding information about our position to Taliban fighters in the area. By the time we realized what was happening, we were surrounded by 40 enemy combatants in terrain that gave them every advantage. How did you get out? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. We didn't all get out. My team leader, Staff Sergeant Morrison, died covering our withdrawal. He was 26 years old, had a wife and 2 kids back home. He died because we made assumptions about those farmers, because we trusted our initial assessment instead of continuing to gather intelligence. The weight of her words settled heavily in the room. Marcus understood now why Sarah was so passionate about training soldiers to question their assumptions. That mission changed how I approached everything. Sarah continued. I realized that in asymmetric warfare, your biggest enemy isn't the other side's weapons or tactics. It's your own preconceptions. Is that what drove you to develop these training methods? Partly, but there were other missions, other lessons learned the hard way. Sarah returned to her chair. I spent 8 years in special operations, deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and places I can't mention. Every deployment taught me something new about how unpredictable real combat can be. What was the hardest lesson? Sarah considered the question carefully. That sometimes there are no good choices. Sometimes you have to make decisions that will haunt you for the rest of your life. But you make them anyway because not making them would be worse. Marcus felt the gravity of her words. Can you give me an example? Libya, 2011. We were tracking a high-value target who was coordinating attacks against civilian populations. Intelligence indicated he was operating out of a compound that also housed his extended family, including children. Sarah's voice became very quiet. We had to decide whether to risk civilian casualties to eliminate a threat who was killing hundreds of innocent people. What did you do? We found a third option. We waited, watched, learned his patterns. We discovered he had a routine of visiting a separate building every morning to check on weapons caches. We took him there, away from his family. Sarah looked directly at Marcus, but it took 3 weeks of surveillance to find that opportunity. 3 weeks during which he continued planning attacks. People died while we waited for the perfect moment. Marcus understood the impossible weight of such decisions. How do you train someone to handle that kind of responsibility? You give them scenarios where every choice has consequences, where there are no perfect solutions. You teach them to gather information, consider options and make the best decision possible with the knowledge they have. And then you teach them to live with the consequences. The room fell silent as Marcus absorbed what Sarah had shared. Finally, he asked, "Why did you leave Special Operations?" Sarah's expression softened slightly. "After 8 years, I'd seen enough. I'd done my part. But more importantly, I realized I could have a bigger impact training the next generation than I could have continuing operations. Every soldier I help train better might save dozens of lives. And that's what drives you now?" "That's what drives me every day. The knowledge that the skills I can pass on might be the difference between a soldier coming home alive or in a body bag." Sarah stood up. "That's why this training program matters so much, Lieutenant. It's not just about improving test scores or evaluation metrics. It's about preparing people for the most dangerous, most complex situations they'll ever face." Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose as he looked at his training facility through Sarah's eyes. "What's next in the program?" "Next week, we start advanced scenario training. Night operations in urban environments with multiple variables and changing objectives." Sarah's expression became serious. "It's going to push your soldiers harder than they've ever been pushed. Some of them might break, and if they do, then we find out now in training, instead of finding out when their lives and the lives of their teammates depend on their ability to perform under pressure." Sarah walked toward the door, then turned back. "Real combat doesn't give second chances, Lieutenant. Neither can our training." As Sarah left the office, Marcus sat alone, contemplating the enormous responsibility of preparing soldiers for realities he was only beginning to understand. He realized that Sarah wasn't just changing his training program. She was changing his entire understanding of what it meant to be a warrior in the modern world. 2 months into the program, the real test came unexpectedly. Marcus was in his office reviewing training reports when his phone rang with an urgent call from Colonel Harrison, the base commander. "Rodriguez, I need you and your special consultant in my office immediately. We have a situation." 20 minutes later, Marcus and Sarah sat across from Colonel Harrison as he explained the crisis. A terrorist cell had taken hostages at a shopping mall 3 hours away. Local law enforcement was overwhelmed, and federal agencies were still en route. The nearest special operations team was deployed overseas. "We need to send a team now," Harrison said grimly. "The terrorists are threatening to start executing hostages in 4 hours if their demands aren't met." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Sir, with respect, my soldiers aren't ready for something like this." "They're still learning the new techniques." "They're the best we have available," Harrison replied. "The question is whether this new training has prepared them for a real-world crisis." Sarah had been silent throughout the briefing, but now she leaned forward. "Colonel, what intelligence do we have on the situation?" Harrison pulled up satellite imagery and radio intercepts. 3 confirmed hostiles, possibly more. An estimated 47 civilians trapped inside. The terrorists have made demands in multiple languages, suggesting international connections. They've demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of police tactics. Sarah studied the intelligence reports with the intensity Marcus had come to recognize. "This isn't random," she said finally. "The target selection, the timing, the tactical awareness. This is a test of some kind." "A test of what?" Marcus asked. "Of response capabilities. They want to see how quickly and effectively we can respond to this type of attack, which means they're planning something bigger." Sarah looked up from the reports. "Colonel, I recommend we treat this as a live training exercise for Lieutenant Rodriguez's team." Marcus felt his blood run cold. "Sarah, these are real people's lives we're talking about." "Which is exactly why we need to handle this correctly," Sarah replied. "Your soldiers have been training for scenarios just like this. Now we find out if the training works." Colonel Harrison nodded slowly. "What would you need?" "A small team, 8 soldiers maximum. Real-time intelligence support. And permission to run the operation according to the new protocols we've been developing." "You want to lead the mission?" Harrison asked. "No, sir. I want Lieutenant Rodriguez to lead it, with me as tactical advisor. This is his team, his training program. It's time to see what they can do." Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. "Sir, I'm not sure." "Lieutenant," Sarah interrupted gently, "you've been preparing for this your entire career. Your soldiers have been training for exactly this scenario. Trust the training. Trust your people." 2 hours later, Marcus found himself in the back of a transport vehicle with 8 of his best soldiers, approaching what could be the most important mission of his career. Sarah sat beside him, calm and focused as she reviewed the latest intelligence updates. Remember, she said quietly to the team, everything we've practiced applies here. Gather information before making assumptions. Adapt to changing situations. Protect civilians first, neutralize threats second. Sergeant Williams, Marcus's senior NCO, nodded grimly. Ma'am, what if the situation doesn't match our training scenarios? Then you improvise, adapt, and overcome, Sarah replied. But I guarantee you'll face situations in there that we've trained for. The question is whether you'll recognize them when they happen. As they approached the mall, Marcus felt his heart racing. The building was surrounded by local police and emergency vehicles, their flashing lights creating an eerie strobing effect in the growing darkness. He could see news crews setting up perimeters, crowds of worried families waiting for information about loved ones inside. The on-scene commander, a local police captain named Torres, briefed them quickly. Hostiles took control of the main corridor approximately 6 hours ago. They've barricaded the entrances and are holding civilians in the central court area. We've had no communication for the past hour. Marcus studied the building layout, his mind automatically applying the training concepts Sarah had drilled into them. What do we know about the hostiles? 3 confirmed, possibly more. They appear to be heavily armed and have demonstrated knowledge of tactical procedures. They've been moving civilians around, possibly separating them by some criteria we can't determine. Sarah stepped forward. Have you attempted to establish communication? Multiple attempts. They're not responding to phone calls, radio communication, or loudspeaker attempts. Marcus felt a chill of recognition. Sarah, this matches the scenario from last week. The one where the hostiles were using silence as psychological warfare. Good, Sarah said quietly. What else do you remember from that scenario? Marcus thought back to the training exercise. They were using the silence to mask movement inside the building. While authorities focused on the main hostage group, they were positioning for a secondary attack. Sarah nodded approvingly. Captain Torres, have you been monitoring all exits? Torres looked confused. Of course. Standard procedure. Not just monitoring, Marcus interjected, understanding dawning. Active surveillance with movement detection. In our training scenario, the hostiles used the central group as a distraction while others prepared to escape with high-value hostages through service. Corridors. Captain Torres immediately radioed for additional units to watch service entrances and delivery areas. Within minutes, his suspicions were confirmed. Thermal imaging revealed movement in areas of the building that should have been empty. Lieutenant, Sarah said, this is your operation. How do you want to proceed? Marcus felt the familiar combination of fear and focus that he'd learned to channel during training. Williams, take 3 men in position at the service corridors. Watch for anyone trying to move hostages out of the building. Johnson, you and Martinez establish overwatch positions with clear sight lines into the main court area. What about the main assault? Sergeant Williams asked. We don't assault until we understand the full situation, Marcus replied, remembering Sarah's teachings. First, we gather intelligence. Johnson, what can you see from your position? Through his scope, Johnson reported what he observed. Multiple civilians in the main court, but they're not grouped randomly. There are 3 distinct clusters, possibly separated by age or gender. I see at least 2 armed individuals maintaining watch, but their positions suggest they're more concerned about external threats than controlling the hostages. Marcus processed this information. They're not focused on the hostages because the hostages aren't their primary objective. Sarah, this is the corporate executive scenario, isn't it? What makes you think that? Sarah asked, though her tone suggested he was on the right track. The separation of hostages, the lack of communication, the positioning. They're looking for specific individuals, high-value targets who happened to be shopping when they took the mall. Marcus radioed Captain Torres. Do you have a list of everyone who was in the mall when the incident began? Working on it. Credit card transactions, security cameras, that sort of thing. Look specifically for corporate executives, government officials, anyone who might be a target for kidnapping or intelligence gathering. While Torres worked on identifying potential high-value targets, Marcus continued deploying his team according to the principles Sarah had taught them. Instead of rushing into action, they systematically gathered information, identified patterns, and adapted their approach based on evidence rather than assumptions. Lieutenant, Sergeant Williams radioed from his position at the service corridor. I've got movement. 3 individuals moving toward the loading dock, but only one appears to be a hostile. The other 2 look like civilians being escorted. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Can you identify the civilians? Negative, but one appears to be an older male in business attire. The other is a younger woman, also professionally dressed. Sarah touched Marcus's arm. What's your instinct telling you? Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, running through everything they'd observed. The main hostage situation is a diversion. The real operation is extracting those two individuals through the service corridor. The question is whether we stop the extraction or follow it to its destination. What would stopping it accomplish? We'd save 2 people but lose the chance to identify the larger network behind this operation. And following it? We risk losing the hostages but potentially uncover a larger threat. Marcus realized he was facing exactly the kind of impossible decision Sarah had described from her own missions. There was no perfect choice, only the least bad option based on available information. Williams, he radioed, maintain visual contact but do not engage. We're going to follow them and see where they lead us. As Marcus made his decision, he realized that everything had changed. This wasn't just a hostage rescue anymore. It was the real-world application of everything Sarah had taught him about modern warfare, where the obvious threat was rarely the actual threat, and where the most important battles were won by thinking 3 steps ahead of the enemy. The test of Sarah's training program was just beginning. The decision to follow rather than intercept proved to be correct, but it also revealed the complexity of the situation they were facing. Through careful surveillance, Marcus's team discovered that the mall incident was part of a much larger operation, targeting multiple high-value individuals across the city as they tracked the extracted hostages to a warehouse complex on the outskirts of town. Marcus found himself coordinating with federal agencies that had finally arrived on scene. The FBI tactical commander, Agent Collins, was initially skeptical of Marcus's unconventional approach. Lieutenant, standard protocol is to secure the hostages first, gather intelligence second, Collins argued during their hurried briefing. Respectfully, Agent Collins' standard protocol would have missed the larger operation, Marcus replied. We now know this cell has been planning coordinated attacks on infrastructure targets. Stopping the mall incident alone would have left the primary threat intact. Sarah watched the exchange with interest, occasionally offering tactical insights but letting Marcus take the lead. Marcus could see pride in her expression as he applied the principles she'd taught him to a real-world crisis. The warehouse complex presented a new set of challenges. Intelligence indicated at least 8 hostiles, multiple buildings, and several escape routes. The extracted hostages were being held in the central building, but thermal imaging suggested there were other individuals in surrounding structures. This is the multi-site scenario we trained for last month, Sergeant Williams observed as they studied the layout. Marcus nodded. Same principles apply. We don't hit one site until we can hit them all simultaneously. Otherwise, we risk the hostiles escaping or harming the hostages. Agent Collins looked frustrated. Lieutenant, with respect, we don't have time for elaborate tactical planning. Those hostages have been in danger for over 8 hours. Which is exactly why we need to get this right, Sarah interjected quietly. Agent Collins, in my experience, rushing into a situation like this gets people killed. Lieutenant Rodriguez's approach gives us the best chance of bringing everyone home alive. The federal agent studied Sarah with new interest. And you are? Someone who's done this before, Sarah replied simply. It took 3 hours to coordinate the simultaneous assault on all 5 buildings in the complex. Marcus's team would take the central building where the hostages were held, while FBI teams hit the surrounding structures. The timing had to be perfect to prevent any hostile from triggering explosive devices they'd detected throughout the compound. As they prepared for the assault, Marcus felt the familiar pre-mission tension he'd experienced during training, but now amplified by the knowledge that real lives hung in the balance. Sarah approached him as he checked his equipment one final time. How do you feel? She asked. Terrified, Marcus admitted, but also ready. Your training, it's made all the difference. I can see patterns now that I would have missed before. I can think past the obvious threat to the real danger. That's the most important skill any warrior can develop, Sarah said. The ability to see what others miss, to think 3 moves ahead of your opponent. I understand now why you left special operations to teach, Marcus said. This knowledge, these skills, they multiply. Every soldier you train becomes more effective, saves more lives, Sarah smiled. That's the idea. But remember, training only takes you so far. In the end, it comes down to making good decisions under pressure. Trust your instincts, but verify them with evidence. The assault began at exactly 2300 hours. Marcus led his team through the warehouse with the methodical precision Sarah had drilled into them. Instead of rushing toward the hostages, they systematically cleared each room, gathering intelligence about the hostiles' capabilities and intentions. In the third room they cleared, they found something that validated every aspect of Sarah's training philosophy. Wall-mounted monitors showed surveillance feeds from locations throughout the city, including government buildings, power stations, and transportation hubs. This wasn't just a kidnapping operation. It was reconnaissance for a major terrorist attack. "Control, this is Rodriguez," Marcus radioed. "We've found intelligence indicating imminent attacks on critical infrastructure. Recommend immediate security alerts for all government facilities." As they moved deeper into the building, Marcus's team encountered exactly the kind of asymmetric threats Sarah had prepared them for. A hostile who appeared to be surrendering but was actually reaching for a detonator, a door that seemed clear but was actually booby-trapped, innocent-looking equipment that was actually surveillance technology. Each time, Marcus's soldiers responded with the adaptive thinking Sarah had taught them. Instead of following rigid protocols, they assessed each situation individually and made tactical decisions based on evidence rather than assumptions. The hostage rescue itself proved to be the most complex challenge yet. The two extracted civilians were being held in a room with 3 armed guards and multiple explosive devices. Traditional assault tactics would have resulted in casualties, but Marcus's team used a combination of distraction, misdirection, and precise timing that created an opportunity to neutralize the threats without harming the hostages. "How did you know the guard on the left would turn when we created noise in the corridor?" Sergeant Williams asked afterward. "Because in training, Sarah taught us to study human behavior under stress," Marcus replied. "People follow predictable patterns when they're nervous. The key is recognizing those patterns and using them to your advantage." The operation was declared a success 6 hours after it began. All hostages were rescued safely. 8 terrorists were captured alive, and intelligence gathered from the warehouse prevented coordinated attacks on 3 major infrastructure targets. More importantly, the operation demonstrated that Sarah's training methods worked under real-world conditions. In the post-mission debriefing, Agent Collins approached Marcus with a newfound respect. "Lieutenant, I owe you an apology. Your unconventional approach saved lives and prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack." "It wasn't my approach," Marcus replied. "It was my training, and the credit for that goes to someone else." He looked around for Sarah, but she was nowhere to be found. Sergeant Williams approached with a puzzled expression. "Sir, the consultant, she left about an hour ago. Didn't say goodbye, just got in a vehicle and drove off." Marcus felt a strange mixture of disappointment and understanding. Sarah had always been clear that her role was temporary, that once the training program was established, she would move on to the next assignment. 2 days later, Marcus found a sealed envelope on his desk with his name written in Sarah's precise handwriting. Inside was a brief note and a set of orders that made his heart race. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," the note read, "your performance during the warehouse operation has been noted by higher command. Your team's ability to think adaptively under pressure, to see past obvious threats to real dangers, demonstrates that the training program has exceeded expectations. Congratulations on your promotion to captain and your new assignment as Director of Advanced Combat Training. Your mission is to implement these methods throughout the military. The knowledge you've gained must be passed on to as many soldiers as possible. Lives depend on it. Well done." Marcus read the note 3 times before the full implications sank in. He wasn't just being promoted. He was being tasked with revolutionizing military training on a much larger scale. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the opportunity to save countless lives. As he looked out at his training facility, Marcus realized that Sarah had given him more than just tactical knowledge. She'd given him a new understanding of what it meant to be a warrior in the modern world. It wasn't about following orders or executing perfect techniques. It was about thinking critically, adapting constantly, and making decisions that protected innocent lives while neutralizing real threats. The lieutenant who had been embarrassed by a seemingly civilian woman just months ago was now a captain charged with preparing the military for the complex realities of modern warfare. And somewhere in the world, Sarah was probably beginning the same process with another unsuspecting officer. sharing the same life-saving knowledge that had transformed Marcus and his soldiers. The mission was just beginning. 6 months later, Captain Marcus Rodriguez stood before a room full of senior military officers at the Pentagon, presenting the results of what had become known as the Adaptive Combat Training Program. The transformation had been remarkable, not just in terms of mission success rates, but in the fundamental way soldiers approached threats and challenges. Traditional training methods resulted in a 73% success rate in complex scenario exercises. Marcus explained to the assembled officers, "The new adaptive methods have achieved a 94% success rate while significantly reducing civilian casualties and collateral damage." General Patricia Hayes, the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff, leaned forward with interest. "Captain Rodriguez, these results seem almost too good to be true. What accounts for such dramatic improvement?" Marcus thought back to everything Sarah had taught him, all the hard lessons learned through real-world experience. "General, the key difference is that we're training soldiers to think rather than just react. We're teaching them to gather intelligence, question assumptions, and adapt to changing conditions rather than following rigid protocols." "Can you give us a specific example?" asked Colonel Morrison from Special Operations Command. "Certainly, sir. Last month, one of our trained units was deployed to assist with a hostage situation at an embassy overseas. Using traditional methods, the approach would have been to establish a perimeter and assault the building. However, the unit commander applied adaptive thinking and realized the hostage situation was actually a distraction from a larger operation targeting the embassy's classified files. Marcus pulled up satellite imagery on the room's display system. Instead of rushing into the obvious threat, they conducted surveillance and discovered a secondary team preparing to breach the embassy's secure communications center. By addressing both threats simultaneously, they not only rescued the hostages but prevented a major intelligence breach." The room erupted in murmurs of approval and amazement. General Hayes raised her hand for silence. "Captain, what resources would be required to implement this training program military-wide?" Marcus had been preparing for this question for months. "The primary requirement isn't financial, General. It's philosophical. We need instructors who understand asymmetric warfare, facilities that can simulate real-world complexity, and most importantly, leadership willing to embrace uncertainty as a training tool." "What do you mean by that last point?" Colonel Morrison asked. "Traditional military training emphasizes predictability and control. Soldiers learn to execute specific responses to specific threats. But modern warfare is unpredictable and uncontrolled. We need to prepare soldiers for situations where there isn't a perfect answer, where they have to make the best decision possible with incomplete information." After the presentation, Marcus was approached by General Hayes. "Captain, I'm impressed by what you've accomplished. However, I have to ask, where did these training methods come from? They don't match any existing military doctrine." Marcus had anticipated this question and had clearance to provide a general answer. "The methods were developed in collaboration with a consultant who had extensive special operations experience, someone who understood the realities of modern asymmetric warfare. Is this consultant available to help with broader implementation?" Marcus smiled, thinking of Sarah's mysterious departure and her tendency to appear where she was most needed. "I believe she's already working on that, General. The knowledge she shared with us was never meant to stay in one place. It was meant to spread." 3 weeks later, Marcus received an encrypted email that made him grin despite himself. It contained a single line of text and a photo. The text read, "Heard about your Pentagon briefing. Well done, keep spreading the knowledge. S." The photo showed a group of soldiers at what appeared to be a European training facility, working through one of the complex scenarios Sarah had developed. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was Sarah herself, wearing different clothes but with the same focused expression Marcus remembered. That evening, Marcus walked through his expanded training facility, watching as instructors he'd trained were now teaching the next generation of soldiers. The program had grown from a single experimental unit to a model being implemented across multiple branches of the military. Sergeant Williams, now a staff sergeant and senior instructor, approached with the day's training reports. "Sir, the new group from Fort Bragg is adapting well to the methods. They struggled at first with the ambiguous scenarios, but they're starting to understand the principles." "Good," Marcus replied. "Remember, The goal isn't to make them comfortable with uncertainty. It's to make them effective despite uncertainty. Roger that, sir. By the way, there's someone here to see you. Says she's from the Department of Defense, here to observe our training methods. Marcus felt a familiar chill of recognition. Did she give her name? Chen, Sarah Chen, she's waiting in your office. Marcus hurried to his office, his heart racing with anticipation. But when he opened the door, he found a different woman entirely. This Sarah Chen was younger, with dark hair and an earnest expression that suggested limited field experience. Captain Rodriguez. I'm Sarah Chen from DoD. I'm here to learn about your training methods so we can implement them at other facilities. Marcus felt a mixture of disappointment and amusement. Of course. Please have a seat. I'd be happy to share what we've learned. As he began explaining the training philosophy to the new Sarah Chen, Marcus realized that the original Sarah's mission was continuing exactly as she'd planned. The knowledge was spreading, multiplying, saving lives in ways that would probably never be fully measured or acknowledged. That night, alone in his office, Marcus looked at the photo Sarah had sent him and understood something fundamental about her approach. She wasn't trying to create a cult of personality around her methods. She was creating a movement, a new way of thinking about warfare and training that would outlive any individual instructor. The principles she'd taught him were now being passed on by dozens of instructors to hundreds of soldiers, who would carry that knowledge to their own assignments and share it with others. Each person who learned to think adaptively, to question assumptions, to see past obvious threats to real dangers, became a force multiplier for safety and effectiveness. Marcus picked up his phone and called his wife, something he'd started doing regularly since Sarah's training had taught him the importance of maintaining perspective on what truly mattered. "How was your day?" she asked. "Productive," Marcus replied. "We're making a difference. Real people are coming home alive because of what we're teaching here. That's what you've always wanted, isn't it? To make a difference." Marcus thought about the journey from that embarrassing morning when Sarah had first taken him down on the training mat to this moment, when her methods were being implemented throughout the military. "Yeah, it is. And I finally feel like we're doing it right." As he hung up the phone, Marcus noticed another encrypted email had arrived. This one contained just a photo with no text. It showed a group of international soldiers at what appeared to be a NATO training facility, working through an exercise that looked remarkably similar to the one Sarah had developed. Marcus smiled and deleted the email, understanding the message. The knowledge was spreading beyond just the American military. Sarah's mission to improve how warriors prepared for modern conflict was becoming a global phenomenon. Years later, when military historians would analyze the dramatic improvement in special operations success rates and the reduction in civilian casualties during complex missions, they would note the emergence of what became known as adaptive warfare doctrine. They would cite the work of various training facilities and innovative commanders who had revolutionized military education, but Marcus would always know the truth. It had started with a woman who looked like she didn't belong on a military base, who had used his own assumptions against him to teach the most important lesson of his career. In modern warfare, your biggest enemy is often your own preconceptions. The lieutenant who had landed a blow on a seemingly harmless civilian had discovered she was a highly trained Navy SEAL. More importantly, he had discovered that the most dangerous opponents are often the ones you never see coming, and the most valuable allies are sometimes the ones who challenge everything you think you know. The mission Sarah had started with one embarrassed lieutenant had become a revolution in how warriors prepared for the complexities of modern conflict, and somewhere in the world she was probably still teaching that same lesson, one surprised officer at a time.